Monsieur de Margerie has been Ambassador of France to the United States since 1983. A more appropriate man for this post could hardly be found. His very background reflects the political and cultural life of his country. The ambassador was born in Paris, the son of an ambassador of France and member of the Conseil d'État, the great-grandson of the writer and economist Eugene Rostand, and great-nephew of Edmond Rostand, the author of Cyrano de Bergerac. He was educated at French schools in London, France, and Shanghai, and then at the Sorbonne. In the French diplomatic tradition, he received a law degree from the Institut d'études politiques and an additional postgraduate degree from the École nationale d'administration. He served in diplomatic posts in London, Moscow, Tokyo, and Washington until 1972, when he served as the equivalent to our Assistant Secretary of State. He headed the Department of European Affairs for France. Departing briefly the world of diplomacy, he was from 1975 to 1977 Director General of the Museums of France, but was called back in 1977 to be Ambassador to Spain. Beginning in 1981, he served as Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and then, as I mentioned earlier, in 1983, he arrived in Washington. He has been much decorated with honors by his own country, as well as by other countries in which he has served. He and Madame de Margerie are among the most popular diplomatic couples in Washington, embracing those qualities of charm, wit, intellectual depth, and great personal style, which we associate so readily with France and with the French. So it is a great pleasure for me this evening to introduce the Ambassador of France to you now, Emmanuel de Margerie.
Ladies and gentlemen, I was just a little afraid at the idea of being late tonight. I just managed it because I was in the State Department and I was a witness to the swearing in of the new American ambassador to France, Walter Curley, someone whom I met for the first time in China in late 1945. And I think he will be a very popular ambassador to Paris. Now, what was interesting about this ceremony was not only that he was being sworn in and that he was the man who's going to represent your president in your country, in my country, but that it was in the big state room of the State Department, the Benjamin Franklin room. And the man who was presiding over the proceedings benignly was Benjamin Franklin himself, a man who was the first representative of your country to mine, a man who was the most popular man in Paris, lionized by society and the intellectuals, as familiar with the court at Versailles and the king as he was with Voltaire and Rousseau. And that bust of Franklin, who was there smiling benignly, was done by the great French sculptor Houdon. And that, in an image, is the symbol of some of the things I have to say in this year of the Bicentennial. I cannot tell you how impressed I am with the way your country is celebrating events which took place 200 years ago in France. In fact, these celebrations have started years ago. I remember going years ago to the University of California in Los Angeles, and they were already busy preparing their symposiums and their exhibitions. But this movement has been found all over the country. 1,000 events throughout the United States, and 300 of them rather major ones. And what is being celebrated, obviously, is something which would not be celebrated if it only concerned one country, mine. But it also concerns your country, and I think we can safely say that it is one of the great historic events which have concerned the whole world. And this is a feeling which we will have this year in Paris on the 14th of July, when 25 to 30 heads of state and government will be congregating to celebrate what happened 200 years ago, when the President of the United States will be there. It will also be the opening of the World Industrial Summit of the 7 most industrialized countries, and France has this year the honor of being the host of that meeting, and President Bush will be staying for a few days and renewing his acquaintance with your president, an acquaintance which dates to a number of years, when President Mitterrand was first elected in 1981, when he came to this country to celebrate with you the anniversary of the Battle of Yorktown, when he met Vice President Bush, and I myself have had the privilege of being present at 2 successive meetings in the years since I have been ambassador to this great country here, in the Élysée Palace, when the President and the then Vice President had long exchanges of view on the international situation. Exchanges of view which were renewed a few days ago, not more than 10 days ago, at Kennebunkport, when Mr. Bush, now the President of the United States, kindly invited President Mitterrand to come and spend what I will call a family weekend with him, so that they could, far from the pomp of power and in the delightful environment of Kennebunkport, talk quietly about these great problems of international relations which have been to the forefront of our preoccupations all these years, but never more so than in the recent 15 days. So there again at Kennebunkport, there was that feeling of friendship, and there was that feeling of shared values, a common desire to tackle the affairs of the world from the point of view of furthering democracy and freedom. And this is what I want to talk about now. It is, in a way, a paradox that links should have been so close over time between 2 countries which have got different languages, different cultures, different habits, that are very different from the point of view of sociology and everyday life, but which are bound together by ideas. And there we go to the heart of the matter, because it is ideas which brought us together a little over 200 years ago, when the first French group of young officers came to this country in 1776 to celebrate, to help your insurgents try and win the independence of what was going to become the United States of America, the most powerful nation in the world. And I cannot help thinking of these extraordinary links which were then forged by small groups of people. The destiny of countries can sometimes reside in a small group of people who were bound together by bonds of personal friendship and of shared values. Lafayette, when he came over, was impressed by what he saw, and when he came back to France, in fact, he wanted to be the French George Washington, because he had seen the implementation here of what he and the other ones who came with him considered to be the essential ideal form of government in the world. And it is amusing and interesting to think that part of the ideas which your founding fathers had were also coming from France through reading Montesquieu, who was the originator of the theory of separation of powers and who had a considerable influence on the drawing up of certain of the constitutional texts which were to be the incarnation of the political thinking of this country and which were to have a very considerable influence in return on the political thinking of France. I was mentioning these young officers from the French nobility who came to this country. They were the representatives of a very privileged class. And the ideas they brought back with them were different ideas. Ideas of either no privilege or shared privilege. And these were the ideas which led to the drafting in France of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in the summer of 1789. But what is worth noting is that our declaration was the product, the merging of a number of texts written and submitted by a number of people who were involved in the proceedings, one of whom was Lafayette. And Lafayette was having weekly meetings in Paris with the American minister. And the American minister was none else than Thomas Jefferson. And the Constitution of Virginia had a very strong impact on what was to become our Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, just as it had a strong impact on what, a month later, in this country, in the summer of 1789, became the Bill of Rights. Now, these are the two fundamental texts which the world over are recognized as heralding democracy. I will just give you an anecdote. A certain number of years ago, I was stationed in a very important country, which I will not be naming, one of the most powerful countries in the world, whose conception of the government was certainly very far from your or our conception of government. And France had an exhibition in that country. And we had an information pavilion. And we wanted to show the visitors what France was about. And we were looking for something which could be immediately understandable, which would be of great quality. We didn't want any gimmicks. And something which would make a strong impact on visitors who were living in a country where they did not enjoy much freedom. And after thinking a while, I was in charge of this section, I went to the great encyclopedia and I reread the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And it was interesting for me to read it, because in the immediate post-war years, the prevalent idea had been in France that that text was a little passé, that text was certainly a very important one in its day at the moment of the French Revolution, but that it did not take into account lots of things which had happened since, things which were of vast importance to the world, and which had to incorporate in a new text the emergence of a new notion of human collective rights of society. And there was a lot to that. It was quite true that the human being does not live isolated, but that he lives in society, and that this has got consequences which have got to be codified. But in the spirit of the post-liberation days in France, one went overboard and one rather forgot that the rights and also duties of the individual had to be mentioned and elaborated. And I reread that text, which to many of my generation would have seemed passé. And reading it in that country was an extraordinary experience, because every word of it shone with brightness in an atmosphere which was not always bright. Every word of it had kept its revolutionary spirit in the best sense of the word. So we decided that we would put the whole text at the entry of the pavilion, and that next to it we would put the translation in the language of the great country where I was stationed. And I went there and I had a look at the visitors who were coming in. And I will never forget the fascinated look on their faces when they were reading line by line a text which, to them, living in a closed society where human beings were not free to assert themselves, suddenly appeared as a message of revolution in the best sense of the word and hope. And I felt I was rewarded, and I felt that history meant something. Now, your Bill of Rights has had exactly the same impact, and these two texts are cousins. And what is interesting is that today you have the Bill of Rights in the National Archives of the United States. But believe it or not, for the first time in the history of France since these times, the text, which was the original, not printed on paper text, but impressed on copper text of the Declaration of Human Rights, is in this country to be seen in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, where it arrived the other day, carried by a special plane, a Concorde, which had left Paris a few hours before to be lent to the people of the United States as a token of the esteem and friendship of the French nation, and as a reminder of these shared ideas between all of us. And the tragic thing, and this is where history can be so symbolic is that the text which is there, displayed in the entry hall of the Smithsonian Building, is not one of these beautiful texts on paper with magnificent typography and beautiful engravings. It is a battered piece of copper where all the letters can be read, but which has been folded together because it was pressed down by people a few years afterwards in France when the monarchy was overthrown. The text, which had been signed by the King of France, suddenly, in the eyes of some of the ultra-revolutionaries of the day, became a text which was reactionary. It was a text which was, in their view, tainted by the monarchy, by having been approved by the king, and therefore, in their short-sighted view, they considered that it was counter-revolutionary, and they smashed it. What a lesson for us as to what the vagaries of history can be, but also what a lesson as to the permanence of ideas, since it is now one of the most treasured pieces in our national archives, and since it is here in the United States of America for a few weeks. Now, I have been using once or twice, perhaps, the expression revolutionary in the best sense of the word. And that leads me to say something which illuminates the way we conceive our celebrations of this year. What we are celebrating is ideals. What we are celebrating is principles. It is not things that at some stage went wrong. It is not the terror. It is the revolution such as it shone in the minds of the people who wanted things to change. And what is fascinating this year is that there is, the world over, an enormous amount of books which are coming out. I was meeting someone a moment ago who was reading one of the volumes which are having now a very considerable success, which is Citizens. But there are other books coming out also. And there's a fascinating book, for instance, by Professor Kennedy, the head of the Museum of National History in Washington. And what is so fascinating is to see that whereas there has been disagreement for 200 years with different conceptions of the French Revolution banded by X, Y, or Z, this still goes on now. There are some people who love it, there are some people who dislike it. And what I find extremely interesting is that some of the works, which are at loggerheads, I would say, coming from different points of view, some of these works are equally well researched. So we have to accept the idea that facts can be grouped together, that they can be grouped differently according to the philosophy of the person who groups them, that there is always an uncertainty in the human mind about what goes on. And this does not surprise me in the least, because as a diplomat, I constantly see this sort of thing. I constantly see nations having very strong feelings, very strong opinions, which are very different, and which conflict between themselves, because what they observe and what they perceive as truth does not correspond necessarily to the perception of another person or another nation. My view would be not a skeptical one, but a tolerant one. We must accept the idea that there can be different interpretations of history, we must not consider that there is always one simple, single truth to be observed by everyone and accepted by all. We can accept the view that reality is rich enough to be looked at from different points of view, and I think that that is a great lesson of tolerance and a lesson in the art of trying to understand the way other people's mind works, which for me is near the essence of what international relations ought to be about. So I just mentioned this fact to say that there are reappraisals by historians, that the French Revolution is an event which has had such an impact in the world that people still today feel the need to explore it, to study it, to comment it. I think 200 books have been published, and quite a number of them in this country. And the celebrations I was mentioning are taking place in the world over, in Latin America, in Japan, in Italy, in Germany, in Africa, in the Caribbean. I was recently in New Orleans. There was a fascinating symposium in New Orleans on the revolution in the Caribbean. And that explains part of the things which happened. When the Creoles arrived fleeing San Domingo into New Orleans, they brought something which they contributed to what was going to be your country. And all these different streams which make big rivers are now being studied everywhere, and the part played by the great historic figures is something which serves as sort of what in French we call point de repère, criteria to compare events. And it is fair to say that one of the lessons of all this flourishing of books is that nothing could have been explained if one only wanted to concentrate on men, because it was men who were moved by ideas. But nothing could be explained if one forgot the part played by men. And I have a token of this every year. The public is allowed in, all the ambassadors are invited, and as we, the ambassadors, file in one by one in the House of Representatives, what greets us but two great portraits on each side of the speaker's rostrum. On one portrait, very obviously, is George Washington, and the other one is Lafayette. And I can tell you that as a Frenchman, I feel touched and happy at the idea that my compatriot should be thus honored. I have got to do something here. Okay? Can you hear me at the end? All right. So I was not astonished recently when I was invited to the Senate to receive an award meant for a Frenchman. It was a posthumous award. The man had died. It was Lafayette. And as I received the Eagle Award for a man who's been dead for 150 years, I was happy because in that room there was a Frenchman who's over 80, who's the direct descendant of Lafayette, and who by American law is also a citizen of the United States of America. And his love of this country is so deep that he lives part-time in Washington. just as was deep the love of his forebear. And it was only recently that I learned from the Secretary of the Army, Mr. March, that when Lafayette was buried, he was buried in France, of course. You know, he'd come back to this country 50 years after the great events to which he had been a witness and in which he had been a great actor. And he had a triumphal journey in the United States, I think it was in 1825. And then he came back to France, and a very old man, he died. And he asked to be buried, and he was buried in earth coming from this country here, which had been transported from one of the battlefields on which he had fought to be the earth in which he would remain forever in French territory. And I think that that is very symbolic, just as I thought something was very symbolic recently when I was invited to go to the triennial meeting of a very distinguished group of people who are the descendants of the officers who fought with General Washington, the Cincinnati, the Society of the Cincinnati, well known in this state here of Maryland, where there are 13 chapters of the Cincinnati in the United States, each one in one of the first states of the Union. But there is also a 14th chapter, and that 14th chapter is in France, and it is the descendants of the French officers. And there was a big delegation coming from France to honor their American friends, and I was moved by a ceremony which took place in their meeting place in Savannah. The French forces, under the command of Admiral d'Estaing, landed in Savannah in 1779. And there was a big battle which was fought, and where I must confess that the Americans and the French, who were fighting together against the other party, were not the winners. But never mind, they did fight together, and their blood was spilled in common. And the descendant of one of these officers was there. He was the president of the French Society of the Cincinnati, the French chapter, the Count de Castres. And with the American President General of the Cincinnati, the Count de Castres and the American president laid a wreath on the river where the French troops had landed in 1779 and where the Count de Castres of 1779 had been wounded. And there you really got a feeling of history and of the permanence of history and what history means. But this has not been the isolated alliance in the history of our two nations, spanning a few years in the end of the 18th century. Because since we had these ideas in common, we were led to fight in common for these ideas over the centuries. And need I remind you that it is the United States of America who crossed the Atlantic the other way and who came to help us in France recover our freedom in both world wars. You know what D-Day was in France when all the Allied forces under the command of General Eisenhower landed to start the liberation of France and of Europe. And aptly enough, in the city of Caen, the capital of Normandy, a monument has been erected, not a sort of dead monument, a live monument, a museum dedicated to the Battle of Normandy, to the war, to what the war has meant, and that is a very moving museum because allies and their then enemies are both, all of them, together in that museum. The first stone was laid by Monsieur Chirac, the Prime Minister of France, 3 years ago. And it was very impressive to see that we were not only there, all the allies who had fought together, the British and the Americans and the Poles and the French and others and the Canadians, but that there were the representatives of Germany, of both Germanys, and of Italy, because the meaning would not have been complete of that museum if it had not incorporated and made physically visible to all the will to have a reconciliation as a step to a better future. And last year, President Mitterrand came with his government, the Prime Minister, 5 ministers of the government, to open the museum. There was a great American presidential delegation, and they all gathered on the great esplanade in front of the building, and the esplanade was named, aptly enough, Esplanade Eisenhower. And I'm glad to tell you that this has received enormous support in this country. I am privileged as the French ambassador in Washington to be a member of the American committee when my American colleague in Paris is a member of the French committee. And the American committee have been so active, and they have done such a beautiful job, that the number of American supporters of the museum has grown from 5,000 to 10,000, from 10 to 20 to 30, and there are now 35,000 American citizens who are supporting this great enterprise. And I must tell you that I have not yet met someone, French or American, who has not gone to see these places, these great landing beaches of Omaha Beach or Utah Beach, or that museum, without feeling profoundly stirred and without experiencing a feeling of very strong and renewed friendship. People have fought and died, and Americans and French have spilt their blood for the common cause of freedom. And that is the essential message which we can derive from this celebration of the Bicentennial. But ladies and gentlemen, I think you would not find that I am complete if I did not try to move on in history and tell you is what my country is doing. Is there still a revolutionary spirit in France? Well, my answer is yes. If by revolutionary spirit we mean the will to change things, not to be content with the situation, but to tackle reality, to improve the condition of the human beings. 10 days ago, the two presidents, President Bush and President Mitterrand, were together at Boston University, both receiving honorary degrees from the university, and addressing the concerns and topics of our present age. And my president spoke about the importance of mastering technical progress, but of using it, not of turning one's back to it, of using it for human progress. And that is where the revolutionary spirit, which we still have, finds that there is a lot of work to be done. It has meant for France, which is traditionally the country where arts and culture flourish, which is renowned for its way of life, its taste for style, its art de vivre. It is important to notice that in this same country, the revolutionary spirit has turned us now towards technology, modernization of things, scientific experimentation. Just to give you a few examples, I will say that with our British friends, we have manufactured the Concorde, which I mentioned a moment ago as having brought the Declaration of Human Rights in as many hours as it probably in 1789 took weeks to cross the Atlantic. So we have the fastest plane in the world. We also have the fastest train in the world, the TGV, the train à très grande vitesse, which operates at an average of 120 miles an hour, which can go to 240 miles an hour. And I am sure, because the French are not good at public relations, and that is one of the things I deplore, but I am sure that if one were to ask an audience, what is the quickest train in the world today, many people would instinctively feel inclined to say, oh, I'm sure it's in Japan. Well, no, it just happens it is in France. I don't know for how long, but at the present moment it is in France. And to give you another example of the sort of revolutionary conversion of France to the modern world, I will say that the civilian use of nuclear energy has been something which has been a revolution in our history. And today we are the nation in the world with the highest percentage of electricity coming from nuclear origin. 70% of the electricity which operates in France is of nuclear origin. And this has been done in circumstances where we have been extremely careful not to have any pollution inconveniences out of it. And I will just say one thing. It is that at this present moment, when all your authorities and my authorities and all the governments the world over have got this great concern about the environment, when governments are meeting, holding conferences to study what is called the greenhouse effect, well, we have great satisfaction to know that we in France, with our clean nuclear energy, we do not contribute to pollution in that direction. We do not contribute to what is called the greenhouse effect. I could also say that France is today, with its European partners, and we're the leading member of a group called Ariane Espace, the principal launcher of satellites in the world. So this is just to tell you that France has become a very modern country indeed, that our spirit of enterprise goes on. But, and that would be my third and last example of what the revolutionary spirit can mean, we would not be content with that. We would not be content with something which would operate in a purely national framework. What World War I and even more World War II have taught us is that after long fighting, fratricidal fighting between European powers, the need for reconciliation had been so important that we had to get together, all of us, and try and construct common European unity. And that is, to my mind, the revolutionary challenge which faces France and its partners for the years ahead. The revolutionary spirit today is paradoxically enough to undo some of the things which were done by the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution, with its concern on the individual, on sovereignty of the nation, on the emergence of the nation as the center of power, did something which has been of the utmost importance for the development of the world for 150 years. But today we must be conscious of the fact that progress lies in the field of integration, that national independence can no longer be total, I would venture to say, for any country in the world, that we have to learn how to blend our sovereignty and our independence with the sovereignty and independence of other nations. So we are no longer now acting in a purely national framework. I will only give you one example. France is no longer master of its external trade policy. The external trade policy of the countries which are members of the European community are conducted by the Commission in Brussels. We are blending our national governments with a new form of government common to all of us. And ladies and gentlemen, what is so important is that all this is being done in the European framework, in the framework of a European community of nations which itself is a member of the Atlantic Alliance, of which you are the leading member. And the United States, conscious of what the merging of the 13 original states has meant in its long history, already long now of these 200 years, the United States has from the beginning encouraged the movement towards European unity, because we know that in the world we live in, real democracies are not that many, and that if the Western world wants to be healthy, it must rest on two pillars. It is safer resting on two pillars than on one. And as President Kennedy said it, next to the American pillar, there must be the European pillar. And I am very happy to say that your president, just as President Reagan did before him, and as other American presidents have done in the past, has brought his full support to this concept. And I think that the trip which President Bush is now making in European countries is very symbolic of the fact that Americans and Europeans must act together. But I am very proud to say that the founding father of this European unity movement, of this community, was the Frenchman Jean Monnet, who lived in this country and who had studied very closely the way the United States of America came about. So you see that we go back to 200 years ago, that the revolutionary spirit which led you is still alive, that it is a challenge for all of us today to build this great sort of common Western world in the spirit of what the founding fathers of the American Revolution and the French Revolution did 200 years ago.
Within the course of events of the present time, how does the factor of, how do you view the factor of German reunification, or the potential factor of German reunification?
Well, that is a very topical question at present. You know that for a long time Germany was separated in two. It still is separated in two. But for the first time, one is now beginning to imagine conditions in which the two split halves of Europe will once again be able to forge common links. How this will happen between Western European and Eastern European countries, I cannot yet imagine. It is hard for us to know how things will happen. What we do know is that things can only happen in the framework of democracy, free voting, one man, one vote, and that the artificial separation between Eastern European countries and Western European countries is not necessarily a thing which will always remain. And this, of course, applies to the reunification of Germany. I don't think we can look at the sort of crystal ball and see how things are going to happen, but we do know that democracy is essential, that the only means for East and West to get together is through the free choice of individuals, and that free choice will one day certainly make itself felt. One of the things I would like to say about what we call the European construction, which means the building of this community which we want to make stronger, and which has become bigger, because we started with 6 members in the European community, and then we went on to 9 members, and then we went on to 10 members, and then Spain and Portugal applied for membership, and we're now 12 members, which is obviously a token of success. If the community had been a failure, you wouldn't have had all this long list of applicants who have now joined. But what I want to say is that this community, which for the moment is composed of Western European nations, is already beginning to have a certain power of attraction, and that there are interesting signs coming from the more liberalized country on the other side, which is Hungary, that Hungary is interested in having some evolving relationship with the European community. Now, there's not only Hungary, but there's also Austria. Austria is neutral, but Austria has felt for some time that if it wants to develop its possibilities to the full, it must establish another kind of relationship with the community. And the interesting thing about both Austria and Hungary having these sort of parallel yearnings is that both of them were, before 1914, members of the same ensemble. So you see the influence of the past reasserting itself in the present framework of Europe much more strongly than anyone would have expected only 5 years ago. I cannot envisage what forms these movements towards a closer relationship will take, but I do know that there will be a closer relationship through some form or another.
Perhaps in closing, you'd like to comment upon the historic moment that we're living through now with respect to East-West relations.
I think what has just happened in the last 15 days is of absolutely vital importance. We are now emerging out of the Cold War. Your president has taken a very important initiative. He has come up with new ideas which have been accepted by his partners. Some of them may create some problems to some of us. For instance, we, the French, or our British friends, who have got nuclear capacities might have some problems at one moment or another. But the important thing is that a fundamental orientation has now been taken, that the cohesion of the Western Alliance has been reaffirmed. There was a moment when things were a bit wobbly, as you have read in the newspapers these recent days, and there was a controversy with the German government. I think this has been solved to everyone's satisfaction. I think that out of this moment of trial, the NATO alliance has emerged stronger than ever. But what I think is of vital importance is that at the present moment, some conditions appear to be appearing on both sides, East and West, which allow us to think that if the situation is well handled, we can move towards a situation where the level of armaments will decrease very significantly, where the arms race will be quietened down, where a healthier relationship will be established between the communist-dominated countries of Eastern Europe and the Western members of the alliance. And I think that what has been happening in these last 15 days has been extremely positive, and something which many of us who are familiar with these problems, who have been studying them over the years, would not have dared think could happen as quickly and as positively as things are now shaping up. So I think we're living a very important and positive moment.
In brief, Mr. Ambassador, we thank you enormously. We're grateful to you for sharing your wisdom and your grace with us this evening.